Moral problem, weakness, badness. Get them strong and good and they'll be fine. Some of the problems with that position, though, are these. They say that addicts do bad things and are therefore bad people. Anybody who does bad stuff is a bad person. The problem with that is that when you're witnessing some of the bad things, a drug is at work. And drugged behavior, you've got to make a decision whether drugged behavior reveals the truth or distorts the brain. Now, I think a poison distorts the brain. So if someone is doing bad things when he is poisoned, I'm not particularly going to interpret that as indicating the true person, who he is. I'm going to say he's drugged. Post-surgical patients do crazy things. Are they crazy? No, they're drugged. That's why they do crazy things. They walk out of hospitals without, nothing but a robe. In recovery, when they're all pumped up with drugs, they may say and do crazy, strange, uncharacteristic things. But to interpret that as the real human being, not me. I'm not going to do that. They say alcohol and drug use is voluntary. Therefore, addiction is self-inflicted. So if you have one, shame on you. You did it to yourself. Well, the problem with that one is that that to assume that everyone's drinking is voluntary really begs the question. The question is drinking under the rule of nothing but the unaffected will? Is it, in other words, voluntary, of the free will, of a will that's not impaired by anything else? And again, the question is, Mark Shuckett, the guy who watched those kids, right, tested whether or not their body sway changed, is their drinking under the control of nothing but their willpower? Or is their drinking governed by factors other than the mind? Their brains respond to a drug in a different way. Is that all mind at work, or is that the human brain either loving the drug or not? So to say it's all voluntary and to say that it's self-inflicted has to completely ignore that we're talking about behavior that is drugged. And you've got to decide fundamentally whether drugs reveal the truth or conceal it or distort it. That's a fundamental decision. I have opted for the natural brain is undrugged. That's the natural brain. So don't show me someone who is full of booze and tell me to interpret his behavior and then do a psych assessment. He's drunk. I'll wait till he's sober. If you take a risk, you're to blame for the results. So you knew that drinking could be risky and you did it anyway, then you're to blame for whatever happens to you. Well, that's an interesting distortion of the word blame. Is this true? If you take a risk, you are responsible for repairing the results that might occur from that risk. Yeah, if I drive my car and I run into somebody else's car, I'm going to have to fix the car. They're not going to fix it. That is my responsibility. But does that equate with I was to blame for the accident? Now, I swim in the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes I swim in, I don't do it much anymore, dangerous places. Now, if I were to drown off the coast of Hatteras, would you be right in assuming I was suicidal because I took the risk? That would be a terrible misinterpretation. To take a risk does not mean that you're to blame for the results. You may be responsible for repairing them. Are you all going to drive home tonight? Could you have an accident? Then it would be right for me to say, well, you chose to drive, you're to blame. No, it's silly, it's crazy. It's playing games with a word, and that word is to blame. To be responsible for dealing with the results of risk does not mean that taking the risk causes a problem. If a solution is moral, then so is its cause. So these people are the ones who point to AA, and they'll say, well, that's nothing but a spiritual program. That's a moral solution. So if it's solved by an act of will, and that going to AA is an act of will, okay? You decide to do that, or you decide not to do that, all right? Just because a problem is solved by an act of will doesn't mean that loss of will, or doesn't mean that badness or weakness, moral corruption, caused the problem. Diabetes, for instance. Some forms of diabetes are entirely solvable through an act of will. You don't have to take any medicine. You just have to follow a diet. If you follow, for certain forms, if you follow the diet, you will no longer be symptomatic of diabetes. Well, one of my best friends, in fact, good to see him in April this year, is a diabetes specialist. And we talk all the time about the similarities of those two diseases. And he's really been fascinated by how AA works and whether or not in dealing with diabetes something similar can be done with his patients, who invariably gain weight. And he wants to know, how can I keep my patients from gaining weight? So, not all solutions point to their causes. Diabetes in forms can be treated by an act of will. You have no proof of a clear physical cause, therefore you can't call it a disease. This is how they reason. Do you know the cause? No. Then it's not a disease. End of story. Now, the problem with that way of reasoning is then, by all accounts, there are certain forms of cancer for which we do not know the cause. And so if that's the case, and we follow that reasoning, we have to kick cancer patients out of hospitals. And nobody in their right mind is going to do that. We're not altogether sure what causes schizophrenia, but you better not leave them out, let them out of the hospital. And sometimes the truth is that a family member, and I can understand this completely, believe me, they're just too angry to think that this is a primary disease. They say it sounds like you're giving them an excuse, that you're letting them off the hook. And damn it, I've been hurt by them. And I want to see them hurt too. I understand that. I get that. I know how difficult it can be to live with an addict and suffer the consequences of that kind of thing. But the truth is, you can be angry at a disease and still call it a disease, and find more productive ways of dealing with the anger rather than denying that you have it. It's a silly thing. Don't deny that you have the anger, just find a healthier way to deal with it, rather than, of course, ending up enabling the disease to continue. Finally, they say addicts look crazy, and if you look crazy, you must be crazy. Well, the truth is that addicts are crazy. They're crazy from alcohol, and when they're not crazy from it, they're crazy for it. This is a disease. Drug behavior always looks goofy. It imitates the symptoms of mental illness. Does a wonderful job of that. Sheldon Miller was a doctor here who said to me once, he said, in early recovery and during active addiction, they're all going to look a little crazy. And in some cases, they are crazy and won't get sane until they stop drinking. All right? Not all of them, of course, will get sane. Some of them are going to have a secondary illness. So alcoholism and bipolar disorder might go together, but they don't cause each other. They coexist with each other. Okay? And addicts do look pretty crazy when they're drinking and drugging, and they do some pretty wild, bizarre, strange things when they're drinking and drugging. And the only way to know whether or not that's the real them or a distortion is get them sober. Most of all, the moral problem hypothesis fails to explain the range of people who become addicted. So you can't look at these thousands of people and say they all fit into this one box. They're all morally corrupt. They won't all fit. It's that simple. You got to put in there a nun and a president and an astronaut and a CEO. They all have to fit into this, their morally corrupt box. And they won't. They just won't. Addicts simply aren't easily categorized as sharing only one thing in common, and that is some kind of moral weakness or form of badness. They just don't fit. All right? That's one of the problems. It assumes that alcohol, which is a poison, uncovers the truth. And I choose to believe that poisons don't uncover the truth, they distort the truth, not reveal it. It ignores that purely moral solutions, you can go to church every day of the week, twice on Sundays, and it still won't reverse tolerance. You'll be as tolerant after all that church as you were before. It still won't reverse that pattern of loss of control. It still won't reverse the phenomenon that 30 years ago Mark Schuckett discovered by examining the children of alcoholics and the children of non-alcoholics. So you can be a priest. And guess what? Moral goodness by itself won't reverse those phenomena, the characteristics of addiction. Won't change those. Okay? You'll still have those. And then it assumes that tens of millions of people have come down with the same moral failing at the same time in the same country. Now that's a whopper when you think about it. We're saying that, depends on whose statistics you want to listen to, all right? From 10 to 15 million people, all came down with this weakness. They drank too much. That seems incredible. That would mean that excessive drinking was the number one cause for all our ills. And I just don't believe that statistically you're going to find tens of millions of people have that moral failing, which shows up in the same way in all of them. By drinking. Not you've got 10 million people who have a moral failing that shows up in at least 3,000 ways. All 15 million had the same moral failing in the same country that shows up in the same way. Drinking. I would expect it to show up in what? 100 different ways at least? All showing up in the same way? To me, that's just statistically out of this world. So you say, no, it's not a moral failing, it's a psychiatric illness. That heavy drinking and drug use reveal an underlying problem while at the same time concealing that problem. And if treatment heals the underlying psychiatric disorder, the patient won't need to drink, will not feel the urge to drink. The truth is that addicts do exhibit a full spectrum of psychiatric symptoms. And the assumption is that something that looks psychiatric, then its underlying causes must be psychiatric. If addicts act crazy, they must be crazy. And the truth is, if you poison yourself regularly, day after day after day after day after day, you're going to look a little crazy at the end of that process. Again, what we need to ignore to believe this stuff is that we're talking about a serious drug that has serious impact on the psyche. And to think that this drug doesn't count, it's not a part of the equation. And it seems to me ridiculous if a patient presents with drinking as a problem, that we then not include it as part of the problem, but act as if, well, that didn't count. Medieval philosopher, a guy named Occam, had a principle of reasoning that went like this: that if you have two potential causes for a problem that can be explained in two different ways, one underlying psychiatric disorder, and the other simply the result of another problem, which one should you go for? And Occam said, if drinking is involved, and drinking can cause lots of psychiatrically looking symptoms, then why not start with the assumption that it's the drinking that caused the psychiatric issues? And how could you tell that? One really easy way. You know what it is, don't you? Take the drinking away. Occam would say simply, if you got two explanations, one underlying, deep and mysterious, the other fairly obvious, right on the surface, he said, go for the obvious. So what happens when we in fact take alcohol away from alcoholics? After an initial period of sadness, resentment, pissed offness, etc., the psychiatric symptoms start to go away on their own in a significant number of cases. Now, if all you do is take alcohol away from a bipolar patient, he's still going to have bipolar disorder, all right? But for the majority, there is no additional psychiatric disorder. The estimates of co-occurring disorders, in other words, you have two problems existing in the same person, the estimates are 1 in 3, as high as that, 1 in 10, as low as that. So Occam would say, why don't we pretend it's the drinking that's the issue here and deal with it, and then let's see what happens. And so there are the issues by itself, all by itself. Alcohol can cause irrational behavior, impulsive behavior, anger, shame, guilt, fear, mood lability, mood swings, paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, seizures, rage, and suicidal thinking. All by itself, alcohol can explain, can be part of the cause of all those issues. And so what we're saying is, let's assume that it does play the role. Take alcohol away and see what happens to that behavior. And again, there are going to be people with co-occurring disorders, but for the majority of addicts, this stuff goes away, sometimes with nothing more than abstinence. Sometimes it takes some additional help from a good friend. Sometimes it takes, well, what's been discovered in our country is AA. That seems to be the kind of support that seems to have the best track record as far as we know. So the psychiatric explanation also fails to explain the premorbid and duly diagnosed population, and that gets overgeneralized. So what you do, see, if all you ever study is alcoholism in a psychiatric hospital, guess what you're going to conclude? You're going to conclude that all addicts have a psychiatric problem. Because in a psychiatric hospital, that's what you'll see most of all, are complicated alcoholics. In other words, those who need both treatments at the same time. Okay, I ended my career dealing only with those kinds of addicts who had an additional depression or anxiety or psychotic disorder, or at least appeared to have a psychotic disorder, etc. But the majority don't have a second diagnosis. And so you take this small group and you overgeneralize them and pretend that's the whole population. If all you ever study is addiction in a veterans hospital, you're going to conclude that all alcoholics have post-traumatic stress disorder. Because that's what you'll see in a veterans hospital. You'll see people who are suffering from both disorders. And you can't overgeneralize that to the whole population, pretend that small subset represents the whole. They do not. There are plenty of addicts who have never been inside a psychiatric hospital. Now, addiction does create some serious issues. If you've been, it makes sense. If you've been drinking a toxin that's a system poison, and you've been doing it for 15 years, do you think that the experience of regular poisoning might affect you, might influence you, might shape you, might change you? I think so. I mean, my God, we're talking about a system poison, and you can't do that for 15 years or 20 years and not have the brain somehow experience its result, the results of poisoning. So you just can't ignore the drug and what the drug does. Sometimes the problems of early recovery are just misinterpreted. In early recovery, sort of that first year, the first biblical year, addicts aren't out of the woods yet. Some people say for a year or for longer. A friend of mine has run treatment programs all up and down the East Coast. And she would always tell her patients that you can count on problems of early recovery for 1 month for every year you drank. And some of her patients hearing that would say, oh, shit. Because they drank for 24 years. And now they face, a couple of years in which they will experience some difficult and troublesome problems. So in early recovery, it's a tough time. The object of early recovery is just to get through it, to do whatever you have to do to not pour alcohol through the hole in your face, not use mood-altering drugs. That's the object. Get through it. Whatever way that works, and of course what works best for most seems to be this AA thing. And most importantly, the psychiatric explanation, it doesn't explain tolerance. If you're a parent and you have a child who's an alcoholic and you think you've caused their alcoholism, give it up. Why? Until you can demonstrate to me that you have the power to cause tolerance, until you prove that to me, I don't think you can do it. I think you're powerless to cause tolerance. I think you're also it's impossible for you to cause loss of control. So you can't cause 2 of the 3 criteria, then you can't cause addiction. So you have to let go of the notion that somehow you are responsible for it. Especially when the tolerance has occurred from the outset. In other words, there are addicts who will tell you that the first time they drank, they could drink more than anybody else in the room. And so if you can't cause tolerance, I know you can't cause it from the start. From the start. So it's letting go of that notion. No psychiatric problem that I know of can make you hold a 5th of whiskey. I don't know of one. Maybe you have heard of one. I don't know one. Research today has given up the notion that we should look at human personality. The research today says, let's look at dopamine, the brain's pleasure chemical, the amine which causes us to feel good. They're not studying the alcoholic personality because there's no such thing. Unless what you mean is the resultant personality after 15 years of drinking. Yeah, if you drink for 15 years, your personality might change. But pre-morbid personality, Dr. George Valiant, after a longitudinal study of 4 decades, concluded that there was no such thing, that it wasn't what caused alcoholism, it's what resulted from alcoholism. The psychiatric hypothesis ignores all of the research on the genetics of alcoholism. And that's the Committee on the Genetics of Alcoholism no longer ask whether genetic factors play a role, they ask which genetic factors play a role. So the research world is pretty much saying genetic factors play some kind of role in this. What you don't explain psychiatrically is the chronic nature, the fact that it doesn't go away, even despite good psychiatric treatment administered under ideal conditions. There's a patient, came in, thought the notion of the disease concept was nonsense. Told us so. I think you're full of bull by calling this a disease. She said, I have a psychiatric problem, and that's why I drink. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to a psychiatrist. And she did. Some member of the staff had his wits about him and said, Helen, don't pay a psychiatrist to examine you when you're either drunk or hungover. Why don't you, for the year that you're going to be in psychiatric treatment, why don't you abstain from alcohol? Since you claim that you don't have a problem with alcohol, okay? And Helen thought that was a good idea. She said, I'm not going to go pay a psychiatrist a lot of money to have him examine me when I'm either drinking or hungover. And so she did it. She did two a week therapy from a guy who did excellent talk therapy and didn't use any mood altering, any of the kinds of drugs with, which addicts have a problem. So twice a week, good therapy, no drugs, and it worked. Helen, she wasn't crazy, but she did need some issue clearing up. She needed some work on childhood issues and relationship issues. So she was really better off after a year of psychiatry. Now, unfortunately, Helen also decided that she would celebrate her newfound mental health. And so she started drinking again. She was readmitted again. This time she said, I still don't believe it's a disease, but whatever it is, I got it. So what do I do about it? We said, now it's abstinence. All right. You do have a primary disease. And we think, without your dogged resistance to the notion, we think we can demonstrate that to you in a very reasonable way. So, even after years of psychiatric treatment, ideal conditions, good doctors, good patients, no drugs, you don't alter the ingredients for addiction. They're still tolerant, they still lose control, and guess what? The disease has progressed. It's worse. It's worse. So give me a definition of a disease. Well, I would say a disease is a destructive process in an organ or an organism with specific causative factors, characteristic symptoms, and if you don't treat it, it'll get worse. Is that an adequate definition of a disease? Somebody said to me, but haven't you included pregnancy? And I said, no, pregnancy goes away without treatment. All you have to do is wait 9 months, okay? Doesn't include the common cold, because again, you don't have to do a damn thing to the common cold except drink water and take aspirin, and it'll go away all by itself. You don't need to do anything else with it. So now, does that explain what we're talking about when we talk about addiction? Is it a destructive process? Oh, absolutely. It has a predictable progression. You can have 10 people in a therapy group, all alcoholics, and despite the fact that all 10 are very, very different from each other, They all, if they continue to drink, they all get sick in predictable ways. In predictable ways. I worked with a counselor who would say to his patient, if the patient didn't believe he had an addiction, well, I'm going to predict for you what's going to happen over the next year or two. And why don't you call me when they start happening? And he did. He called. He said, yeah, what you said was true. It's happening. Is it an organ or an organism? Yeah, the whole human being. I would say an alcoholic, my favorite definition of an alcoholic is that he has the brain of an addict and a mind of one. And it takes both. You've got to have a susceptible brain, and you have to have a denial system. At least a denial system that'll keep you drinking. And yeah, addiction affects the whole human being. Brain, mind, emotions, spirit, relationships. It's a kind of a complete kind of condition. With specific causative factors, sure. We'd say multiple factors play a role. Genetic factors. Ethnic groups, for instance, are more or less susceptible. Jews and Italians have low rates of alcoholism. Native Americans have extraordinarily high rates of alcoholism. And stress doesn't explain that, because Jews have at least had as much stress as Native Americans, and yet they have completely different susceptibility rates. Denial plays a role. Enabling helps. An addict is helped to keep drinking and drugging if he has a group of people who help him deny that he has an addiction. But most of all, the core issue is one of drug susceptibility, drug proneness. You can have a terrible depression if your brain doesn't respond to the drug in the right way. You'll give up drinking as a solution because it doesn't work. The characteristic symptoms are denial, loss of control, tolerance, Jekyll-Hyde reaction, blackouts. When we return, Farlow will explain each of these in more detail. If it's untreated, it gets worse, yeah. In fact, intelligence is no protection. People ask me, is there a difference between a smart alcoholic and a dumb one? And I say, yeah, sure there is. A smart one stays sicker longer. Why? Because he's got a great denial system. Eh? He has been able to piece together all kinds of defenses that will keep him from seeing that he's losing control of his drinking. The future of an untreated addict is jail or insanity or death. In the old Towson group of AA, they used to tell newcomers when they walked in, your future is the group, the grove, or the grave. What they meant was the group, AA, the grove, Spring Grove, the grave needs no explanation. So, are some people prone? Yeah, several hypotheses are presented for that. For some people, alcohol and drugs are not just a pleasant pastime, they're a powerful reward. They make you feel not just good, but they make you feel good. Good. One of the most difficult things for non-addicts to understand is the experience of intoxication in an addict. You think it must be somewhat similar to what you experience when you drink or drug, and it's not like that. You'll have a defense against excessive drinking, and so it won't make you feel good, better, best. It makes you feel lookier, and ookiest. The other explanation is what's called a deficit replacement theory. In other words, addicts are born without something. And what happens is when they drink, drinking supplies it. So there's some research on dopamine, the fact that if you're subpar with dopamine and you drink, you'll get a shot of dopamine. That's feel-good chemistry. there's some pretty good research about that too, that there are some people who, even though their family history is positive for addiction, some kids in that family will have enough dopamine, others won't. And so what seems to explain why one drinks and the other doesn't is the presence or absence of the feel-good brain amine, dopamine. You drink it, and it supplies the dopamine you don't have. Unfortunately, what also happens is, not only does it supply what you don't have, it also then robs you of your brain's natural ability. So every time you drink, you get the dopamine, but to get it is to lose it. So what do you have to do if, when you drink, you lose the feel-good chemistry? How do you get feel-good chemistry? You drink. What's the price you pay? A reduction in dopamine. So how do you get dopamine? You drink. So what happens as a result? A greater reduction in dopamine. And that's where the research goes today. Some people are missing a protective mechanism. They have no rheostat. You go out with 5 people, there are 2 alcoholics in the group. They all start drinking. The 3 non-alcoholics will have 1 drink feel good, 2nd drink feel good, depending on size. 3rd drink, some will feel a little bit better, others will start feeling dizzy, groggy, sleepy, and sick. And so they'll say to the 4th drink, no thanks, I've had enough. And we make this terrible mistake. We think it's the mind controlling his drink. It's not his mind, it's his brain that is controlling his drinking. He feels poisoned, dizzy, groggy, sleepy, sick. The other 2 guys don't have that protective mechanism. So 1 drink helps them feel good, 2 makes them feel better, 3 makes them feel magnificent, 4 makes them feel on top of the world. 7 drinks says, give me a phone, I need to call the president, I got some solutions for us. You say, where's the protection against poison? You know, the answer is, it doesn't exist. For some, it never existed. They always had that response to the drug. Ask them. Ask them. Ask an active alcoholic. Did you ever have that protection? And a great many of them will say, no. And a bunch of them will say, at one time, but I lost it, and I don't know why I lost it. I just seem to not have it. Another theory is genetic susceptibility. If your family history is positive, twin and adoption studies both sort of demonstrate that when your family history is positive and you're adopted away from your natural family, no matter where you're raised, if your family history is positive, you're 4 times as likely to develop alcoholism, even if you're raised in a non-alcoholic family. One is that when you drink alcohol, it triggers a compulsion to drink more, and you can again apply that dopamine research, you know. To get dopamine is to lose dopamine, and so it starts that chain of events. You lose it, you drink to get it. When you drink to get it, you lose it, you drink to get it. Well, once you take the first drink, it says more. There are 5 kinds of studies. Ooh. Twin and adoption studies, genetic marker studies, animal studies, ethnic susceptibility, and brainwaves. Twin studies, if the twins are lookalikes, they have almost twice as much twin-to-twin alcoholism than if the twins are not lookalikes. Because lookalike twins share the same genes. So if one's going to be alcoholic, the likelihood is that the other one will be too, because they have an identical genetic makeup. But with not lookalike twins, they're going to have a rate that's significantly different from that. And the studies sort of prove that, or at least demonstrate that. Family history positives. When the family history is positive, there's significantly more alcoholism, no matter what other factors are at play. Adoption studies show similar results for women. One drug adoption drug abuse adoption study sampled 242 males and 201 females separated at birth from the biological parent and indicated these correlations, that they correlate highly with antisocial personality, which in turn predicted from an antisocial biologic background, that the biologic background of alcohol problems predicted increased drug abuse in adoptees without antisocial personality, and environmental factors of divorce and psychiatric disturbance in the adoptive family were associated with drug abuse. But the drug abuse was subsequent to the family disturbance, but may still have been precipitated antisocial behavior in the child. In other words, trouble in the family might account for some drug abuse, but in enough cases, the drug abuse preceded the trouble in the family. Genetic marker studies, the Corsten, Schuckett, and Lieber work. Family history positives build up more acetaldehyde than others, making them more toxic when they drink. Levels of acetaldehyde in family history positives remain higher over time. Family history positives compared with negative differ in significant ways in levels of acetaldehyde, the ones we demonstrated for you. Release of muscle tension at rest and perceived level of intoxication. And all of these are in my book and documented. That there was one study in which they found that students who carry 2 copies of the short version of a serotonin transmitter called gene 5-HTT are more likely to report troublesome drinking patterns. They engaged more frequently in drinking, drank more often to get drunk, and consumed more alcohol than per occasion than students with the other genotypes. Students with at least 1 copy of the long variant of FHTT consumed a smaller number of drinks at a sitting, even though they went out to drink as often. That's not about the mind. That's about the brain's chemistry. Dr. Nora Volkow is the head of NIDA. Complementing her work with animals, Dr. Volkow found that high levels of dopamine receptors may provide protection against addiction, even in people with a history of family alcoholism. So what Volkow did, basically, was this. She said, I know that there are, the highest proneness is in a family with a history of alcoholism. She also said, however, not every member of that family will develop alcoholism. Research question, what explains why all would seem to be susceptible, but not all are, in fact. And what she discovered was that the answer appears to be dopamine. If you have a healthy supply of dopamine, your chances are reduced. If you have a limited supply of dopamine, your chances are increased. Those same studies were reported for cocaine abuse at the annual meeting of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Results the same. More dopamine, less addiction. Less dopamine, more addiction. THIQs are produced when when acetaldehyde interacts with a brain amine, and it produces a substance called isoquinolones. And isoquinolones are very similar to alkaloids that you find in some narcotics, and may in fact be a part of the explanation for the compulsion to drink. So if you have acetaldehyde mixed with brain amines, you're going to get these THIQs. Guess who builds up more acetaldehyde than others. Family history positive. So they would be then more susceptible to have more acetaldehyde available. And so more a chance of developing problems as a result of the fact that when acetaldehyde teams with others, we increase the chances. More research on the same kinds of things. Levels of THIQs were found to be significantly higher in the urine of alcoholic subjects who were admitted for detoxification. You getting a sense of the research? Salsolinol is a THIQ formed from acetaldehyde. This researcher did this. He went out and found himself a bunch of dead people. She separated them into three groups. One group were called drinking alcoholics. The second group were called sober alcoholics. And the third group was called controlled normals. And what she did is she measured an amine called salsolinol in these three dead bodies. Here's what she found. If you were normal, you built up that much salsolinol. Okay? She defined a drinking alcoholic as someone who died with alcohol in their system. Control normal. If you were a drinking alcoholic, your salsolinol level was this high. In other words, the same as a normal person. If you were a sober alcoholic, she defined a sober alcoholic as someone who has not had a drink for 2 weeks before they died. When she examined salsolinol levels in sober alcoholics, she found this much salsolinol. So why would someone who built up just this much salsolinol, why would they drink? To get to normal, right? Which is where a drinking alcoholic is. So if you drink, you're up to normal. If you don't drink, it's a deficit replacement theory, in other words. Alcohol supplies something that normal people have and others who are alcoholics don't have. This is not about the mind. This is about the brain. They inject the brains of rats over 12 days. And if you, with a, once again, one of those byproducts of acetaldehyde and dopamine. And if you do that, rats who have been rejected alcohol choose it over water in increasing amounts until they get drunk and have withdrawal. So, again, the magic ingredients seem to be dopamine and other amines that it's mixed with, which will cause a rat to drink when he usually doesn't. Animal studies, mice bred to be genetically similar, show either an attraction for alcohol or an avoidance of it. Now, I know some people would say, well, next time I meet a mouse who's an alcoholic, I'll know why. But mice are excellent subjects for research because of their similarities to human brains. If you deplete the level of serotonin in a rat, he'll deplete or reduce his alcohol intake. Unfortunately, when he drinks, he increases his serotonin level. So the only way that he's ever going to stop drinking is to stop drinking, all right? Because when he does, it plays tricks with serotonin. Gene therapy, increasing levels of dopamine, reduce drinking in rats that have been trained to prefer alcohol. This is Volko, Thanos and Volko. So if you alter the genes of certain animals, and increase dopamine, they'll reduce drinking. that will even happen. Gene therapy can reduce drinking even in rats with a genetic predisposition for heavy alcohol consumption. So it looks like, once again, it's that dopamine and what reduces or increases it. Ethnic susceptibility. Jews and Italians have lower rates than Native Americans. Based on a belief that the rates of alcohol had risen among Jews, researchers found in an upstate New York City an astonishingly low rate of 0.1% alcohol abusers in that population. That's not big league. I mean, hell, if they had done that in the Bronx, I think they would have found higher rates. Groups with the lowest incidence are Jews and Italians. Especially the Italians, they have the highest consumption rates. So it's not how much you drink, it's whether or not you're susceptible. Italians drink a lot. They don't develop alcoholism a lot. When you see an Italian alcoholic, he's 59 or 60. Not only is it a low incidence, it has a late onset. So Italians survive. Unfortunately, Native Americans are concerned that they're going to kill themselves off because when they get it when they're young. And so they don't marry and they don't have children. The Sioux have been concerned about that until just recently. With Japanese and Koreans and Taiwanese, they even intoxicate at doses that don't affect Caucasians. So it's easy to get a Japanese or a Korean drunk. They respond pretty dramatically to the drug alcohol. The Chinese subjects metabolize ethanol more rapidly than Caucasians. They even develop a response to it at young ages. There's one I love. They examined arrests in Chinatown. They had 17,000 arrest records over a period of 16 years. What they found is that in Chinatown, not a single arrest noted public drunkenness. So you go to Chinatown, either they hide it pretty well, or they don't lose control. They don't lose control. Again, I'd say if you did that in the Irish sections of New York, I bet you'd find a whole lot more than that. AA did statistics up until 1991. What they found was in Portugal was the fewest AA groups with 0.6 of a group per million population. Iceland was the highest with 800 groups per million. What they also noted is that the Portuguese drink 2.5 times as much as the Icelanders. So what that demonstrates is it's not how much you drink. It's whether or not your population is susceptible. Do we have susceptible hosts? And it appears that absolutely, we do have some susceptible hosts. Brainwave studies. P3 waves are waves that your brain produces when you're asked to make a decision. And it was always thought that alcoholics drank theirs away. What Begleiter discovered was their children have the same deficits, even though the kids he tested were only from 7 to 13 years old. Alpha waves, feel-good waves, 40% higher for family history positives than for family history negatives. So you get more of a rush. So why are some people prone? It works. The drug works. It replaces something that it's not there without it. Addicts have no shutoff valve. Different people do handle the same drug differently. I mean, there are some people who respond very unfavorably to penicillin or to amoxicillin. And that has nothing to do with their minds, it's their brains. And using a drug may trigger the desire, the need to use more of that same drug. So if a disease is a condition in which a bodily susceptibility, coupled with behavior, in other words, drinking, and denial of problems related to it, leads to morbidity, sickness, and problems, despite an individual's will demonstrated by repeated failure to control one's drinking by simply use of willpower, then I suppose disease is the best name that we have for alcoholism. I hope at least it's got you started thinking that way. Hang around. I think the more you hear about this, the more you're going to say, disease is the only one that makes sense.